Fourth video, the post-production. We now take care of the data management and the three programs, LR Timelapse, Lightroom and After Effects. We have now saved all data in one folder. There's the video clip from our gimbal shot in it and of course the raw files from the handheld, the monopod and the tripod version. That means all four methods are collected here in one folder. A short overview about our post-production. Well, we work with LR Timelapse and with Lightroom. We work with them simultaneously. We're jumping back and forth, and after we export the data from Lightroom, we're going to import the stuff into After Effects and do the stabilization there. This is LR Timelapse. As I mentioned before, there's a free version that I work with and it's completely sufficient for the things we're going to do with it now. This is the surface here. You can see the buttons on top which are now grayed out. When we load the images into it, they will be colored. It's actually a step-by-step process that we will go through. Here in the footage folder, which I'm going to select now, there's our data in it. LR Timelapse now loads all images into this folder, reads the metadata, and creates a preview with which we can evaluate the hyperlapse. You can also see that an interval time is calculated here. For example, here in the handheld version we worked with 7 seconds. Then there is a break where for 12 minutes nothing happened, where I went back, where I put my camera on the monopod, and then I basically took the monopod shots. Then of course there's another break for the tripod shot. That means we have all 3 shots in here now. The video file is not listed here. LR Timelapse is a pure image editing program. So, now we mark the first shot here. As I said, here we will see this break in the interval, which is now also marked red. And we move these pictures into this folder, in the folder shot 1. We do the same with the other images, which means that the images have been moved now until this break, and we can now move the pictures again into the folder under Create Folder, Shot 2. Then we take the remaining pictures, mark them, and move them into this folder and name it Shot 3. This means that we now sort our hyperlapses in this folder. I'd advise everyone to do this in an organized way so that we have a better overview. In this tutorial, I'll work with shot 3. That means with our tripod, and I'll edit the other 2 shots separately, but I will only show this here in fast-forward mode. So, shot 3. The blue line that we see here, which can be switched on and off at the top, shows us our exposure. That means how the picture was exposed. Here it becomes very bright. That means our line goes a little bit higher. That means a little bit more luminance in the image, a little more brightness, and then it falls off again. Here, behind the house, and when it appears again, it gets a bit higher. You could say that's our brightness over the course of the hyperlapse. It's pretty much the same, but of course it has some edges that we want to try to get out. First we create a keyframe, or 2 or 3 or more, depending on how many keyframes we want to set. I'd recommend to work with 2 keyframes, i.e. to set a keyframe at the beginning and at the end of the hyperlapse, because this offset of our brightness is not too high. If we have a hyperlapse where we have a strong gradient, a strong change in brightness, then we'll also set an additional keyframe there in order to be able to better work at this point. But now, with the hyperlapse, it's enough to work with these two keyframes. The next item is the Holy Grail. This is a very important tool. It now also says Adjust Exposure Jumps. This means that if we play with our ISO value during the hyperlapse, for example, and we set it higher or lower, we will of course have exposure jumps and we will get them out with this Holy Grail. It calculates a straight line which adjusts the whole image, and we no longer have this offset in the image. That's out of the question with this image. We worked with the same ISO value everywhere, but this tool will definitely find its application. We're going to save these two keyframes and save that in XMP files, and then drag those things into Lightroom. Just drag and drop them into Lightroom. That's where our images are opened. So, this is where the images load in. We have all the images in there now. We import these images. We didn't really want to have all the images, we just want to edit the keyframes. We can see that here in the rating, here are our two keyframes. So that we can only see them, we go to Filter at the bottom and tell LR Timelapse 5 keyframes. That means it shows us the keyframes, end frame and start frame. We now go into Develop and do our first little color correction here. Here is an LUT, lookup table, which I throw on it and with which I also work very often during hyperlapse. We're now going to tweak the image a little bit as we want it to be. I'm definitely going to go out there with the lights very strong so that we can get the details in the sky, and we can also put a little bit of black on here and of course also bring up the depths a bit. A little bit of contrast, only minimal. So, I'm very happy with that now. Another important point is of course the lens correction. Chromatic aberration is already selected in the template. I now also select Profile Correction, which takes away the distortions at the outer edge a bit. I also select the lens with which I shot. That was the 1120 f2.8, and I'm now very happy with the image. Now I click on the second image with Shift and have the possibility to synchronize the keyframe with scripts. This is a very important point so that we can get the same color profile on our second image. We can now compare the pictures themselves. I like it very much. I'd leave it like this now and go back to the library. Press Ctrl plus A, mark both images, save metadata to files, and now these settings are saved in our files. In LR Timelapse, nothing happened for now. We can now reload these changes by clicking Reload, our next button. We don't see anything yet, but we can see that new stuff has been loaded here. The white balance has been changed and of course all our settings we made. Now when we create an auto transition, a transition is created between the images and a visual preview shows us this transition. So LR Timelapse has now created a visual preview for us. It has to be said that the auto transition did not work as well in this example, or was not as clear. An auto transition actually creates a transition between the keyframes. That is, if we have a keyframe that is a bit darker exposed, and in the middle one that is lighter, and then again one that is very dark exposed, the auto transition here creates a curve over these 3 points, giving us a smooth change in the image. This is not the case here now, because the image has the same initial and final exposure, but it is definitely a very important tool when we work with several keyframes. In the visual preview, we can see here that we have very strong spikes in it. This is of course our break in the light, which we have already seen before and which of course has a strong effect on the picture. In the back we have another deep area because of this strong shadow, which shouldn't be of much interest to us, but we should definitely round off these corners again. We can do that with the visual deflicker that you can see here. We can also exaggerate this to infinity, but I wouldn't recommend you to do so, but we should definitely make some adjustments. I'm actually happy with this value here, and for accuracy I leave it at standard, multi-pass deflicker, and 2 passes are enough there. We will now apply this. LR Timelapse now calculates the intermediate images again. So LR Timelapse is now done with the processing. We could play this back now and can see here, especially in these areas, that the image doesn't jump as much anymore because the exposure is lowered a bit and there is a slight fade in the exposure. The picture is already getting brighter here, and therefore the big bang, which is caused by the sun, is not so strong anymore. So that was now the editing. As I said, go through everything step by step. It's a very easy editing workflow here with this program with a great result. I'm going to do the other 2 shots fast forward, and then we can export these files to Lightroom. So, now we have edited all 3 shots in LR Timelapse and can export them to Lightroom. We now have this tripod shot here. What's important, we have to read the metadata again, so that Lightroom applies the changes that LR Timelapse made to our images. Very important point, so that we have all the advantages of LR Timelapse here in our images. I then export these images into a new folder. We choose the folder where the data is stored. I create a second folder, an image out folder, and there I throw the shots with the ending clean into it. I'm going to make the process faster because the export always takes a little time. When we've exported all the shots, we can load them into After Effects and have a direct comparison of the qualities. In After Effects, we can now load the data into here. Simply use Import Image Out, and then we take the first image, load it as a sequence, and do the same for the other 2 sequences. So that we now have all 3 clips in the browser of After Effects. Now, I'm going to bring a little bit of order in here. I make a footage folder and a comp folder where I sort the data a bit. We will now also work with shot 3 here during stabilization. We call it that way. Of course we will integrate it into the comp, and now we have shot 3, which has now opened here too. Now, let's go back into our composition. Into our full resolution 6000 by 4000. I would also recommend you to work with the native resolution, i.e. with the highest possible resolution, because every pixel is important for the stabilization and every pixel gives us a better result. I would recommend working with the highest resolution even if the program is a bit slower. For example, I see a bit of dust or a few particles on the picture which are now buzzing around here. Unfortunately, I can't change that now. You could try to retouch it a little bit, but it's on the picture itself. It probably came up during production, although we had actually made sure that everything was clean. Can happen. A bit annoying, as I said. Always make sure that it is as clean as possible. So, I've now pre-rendered this clip right here. You can see it here on this green bar. Now, we can play this clip relatively smoothly for playing it in After Effects. Of course, the clip itself is not yet smooth. It still looks very desolate. The classic way for a hyperlapse would be to run the warp stabilizer over it on the right side of the tracker. That would give us a reasonable result, but we want to have the best result, and we can do that with the tracker. That means we track our points in the picture, which our camera holds onto, and I'll show you how it works. So, first of all, we select Stabilize Motion in the tracker, and then there is a second window. This is the layer window and the composition window. In the layer itself, we can now move this tracker to any place we want. I'm going to go up here now. In our case, the fixed point was this upper corner here, and I would use that as a fixed point. Maybe you can also use the lower side because there are not so many problems coming into the picture, like for example here, this tower. I'll just let it run now. With this little arrow here, it analyzes the points and we can already see it doesn't work for long. We have to go back a little bit now. We can go back here if we zoom out once. We get a little magnifying glass. It's usually more comfortable to work with. Now we adjust the track point again and just try to analyze again. Did not work. It's because of the flare that comes into the picture. I'll pull our search area a little larger to understand the tracker itself. The inner area is our reference area, which was searched for in every picture. The outer area is the area where this reference area can be searched inside. This means that the next image can be in this area, and the bigger we make it, the more performance After Effects needs. So here's a simple rule. As small as possible, as large as necessary. That is something like that. I'll run it again, yes? It doesn't really work. We can see our track point is going down, so we have to unfortunately adjust it frame by frame. I'll now go to the upper edge of the shot because it's a bit more concise for me than the lower area. Everyone can decide which you'd like. You can also vary it a bit. The point here, which is tracked, should be the same as the point you focused on during the hyperlapse. So, I'm going to try and do this in fast forward mode. You'll probably wonder why this is so complicated. I intentionally used a hyperlapse for this tutorial, which is quite difficult to track. There's also examples where the tracking works much easier and runs more smoothly. Well, there are also hyperlapses where a single analysis gives a perfect result. This was not the case here now, because even the top of this house is too unimpressive. Well, it's not pointed enough here in the perspective that the tracker gets its point there, but we can make it a bit bigger and start a second attempt. Of course, now a pigeon comes into our picture. Anything can happen. That's why I'm going over it again by hand. Now we are done. We can already see from the points that it has become very clean hyperlapse because we have few error images. So you could say that I could have worked a little bit cleaner with these 2 points right here. But in itself, it's a very clean shot that was tracked here. We can now simply apply the XY stabilization to this clip with this small button on the right. This means that if we pre-render it again, we can see that the point stays at the same position, even if I move the mouse over it. And we now have very little offset in the outer image as well, so we really did a clean job there. The only problem remaining is the rolling axis. These are in fact the rotations that we have in the picture. We get rid of them in the second step, either by copying these points and working on them, But as a little tip, you simply create a null object here and throw these copied points, these 3 parameters, here on null object, so that you can have them safely, because now we will track a second point and our first track point in this picture will surely disappear again. Therefore, we save the readout data here and can then work with the second point without any problems. So, the second point should normally be on the same axis for our tracking. In this case, it would be this axis in some way. But I don't have the possibility to find a track point here that is in the picture all the time and is also trackable. Unfortunately, this is not possible during the recording. It was deliberately chosen that way so that we can show you a little bit how it is done even with problem shots. So, I use a relatively close point to the first point. This is actually not so good. The further away it is, the cleaner our rotation axis becomes and the more accurate. But let's use this lower edge of the L, right in the middle of this block. We saved the first point, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. We'll concentrate on this point now, so that we can get a clean rotation axis. It works pretty well up to here. I'm going to enlarge the search area a bit. Also, the lens flare in the picture does not cause us any problems so far. Now it jumps down. Here, I'd recommend working on the track point a bit more. Something like that. I pull it a bit wider and then it goes on. That works quite well now it's finished. It jumped over here again just before the end. I'll adjust it again. But actually we have a very clean track here now. We now have another look at these runaways before we apply it, if they fit. Yes, they fit. It's relatively clean, of course. You can work even more precise, but I'm already very satisfied with the track. As we see it here, the upper one, it's been shot, which means we can go back to this null object. We can also use U to show the keyframes that this track has. This is a very helpful tool. Just press U and then we get 3 parameters here. I copy them and I put them back on the first track point and go to the first keyframe. If I press Ctrl V now, copied to it, they are all back at their point. And the second point, we didn't touch it. It's the same as just now, so everything is perfect. We apply the tracking and let it run through, and you can see that without warp stabilizer, we have a clean ride here, but it rotates a bit around the rotation axis. That's annoying, of course. We don't want that. We can just do that with Ctrl R. We can get a ruler here. Now, the L is on the left side, and actually it should be in the area on the right side. That's why we now have a rotation in here. I can delete the null object and create a new null object. Now, we can just use this null object to get the rotation out. We just move it to our fixed point, and around this point our image should rotate. We can't touch the rotation here because keyframes have been created there. This means that our tracking is in here, and our tracking information is now stored here in the rotation. In order to be able to touch the rotation anyway, we coupled this to a new null object, so to speak. And now we have the possibility to work with the rotation here and now simply try to take a negated value here. From our actual video, here, plus 16, we take a null object, minus 16, that we can get back into the correct rotation. Here we can even look a little bit by ourselves, draw a guideline here and see that it fits well. Now I want to set a keyframe in the middle. But it might be that it rotates a bit forward, just like here. Then we have to work against it a bit. We'll just see how that works best. Maybe I'll keyframe here. Not quite so hard. Maybe a little bit more. We'll go over the middle and go back again. Then I would set another keyframe here to minus 12, maybe even minus 13. That's almost always the negative value. We have to be careful that this value is not exactly accurate because we have such an offset in our rotation. So don't always copy this value, but search and find the perspective yourself. I'm actually really satisfied with this. Let's have a look at it. It already looks good. I'm very happy with it. I'd leave it like that now. Now the tracking process is actually over, and we want to work out the finer points. I recommend you to make a new composition out of the selection. We call it 3A, that's our continuation. Now I want a full HD player in 16:9. It always depends on what you want. If I set its scaling to 65, we then have the picture frame that is now possible for us. Of course, we have to be a bit careful not to show our mistakes, which we can see here, for example. So this black border here, we have to be a bit careful that it doesn't get into the frame. But it looks very good here in the picture. The lens flare is also relatively clean here in the picture and does not wobble much. That's always a difficult part to get this lens flare clean, but I'm very satisfied. Now, of course, to work it out even more finely, I would put this warp stabilizer, which we all know, over it. I usually work here with the detailed analysis extension and set the smoothing to 100%. The smoothing I set to only 1 or 2 here. We'll have to look at it right away and just let it run through. The stabilization is now finished and we can have a look. The auto scaling always tells us a little bit how good our tracking was. That means 101.7 is a relatively small value. If we increase it here, it won't go much higher, maybe 102 or so. I would not try to go higher than 5 here because the warp stabilizer brings some very unpleasant distortions into the picture and the picture starts to wobble. I would recommend to work with a lower value, and if the picture is still not well stabilized, then you have to rotate it again, or maybe you have to start tracking again. So here's my recommendation. Don't use a value higher than 5, maybe 10 at most. It might work from time to time, but I wouldn't go up there. That doesn't help us. We've simply worked too imprecisely. I'll let it run through here again, then we can take a look at what we have already achieved with our tracking process. I have the feeling that this shot is very clean. Of course, it also has not quite as many foreign bodies in the picture due to the exposure time with which we could play again, which are then not as noticeable as with the other two variants. So, and that would be our hyperlapse, which is already very clean and I like it very much. Probably you could have taken a little more time to get the flares clean because they have such a minimal wobble in them. But in itself, this is already a very clean hyperlapse. I like it very much. For me, the next step to make the hyperlapse even cleaner would be the motion blur. We can add that to this shot. I use a plugin for that. This plugin is called Real Smart Motion Blur, short RSMB. Here, I add the Pro effect, and this effect adds a motion blur to the picture, as you can see here. I set this to 0.3, and this plugin gives us a small motion blur, especially down here, where there is a lot of movement in the picture, where a lot happens. This also makes our shots look a little bit more smooth. A nice effect that I often use is an adjustment layer with a mask. This mask is then usually so oval over the video. Subtract the mask. We can now also add lumetri to the mask so that we can see it and evaluate it. We say here exposure down and see now where our mask lies approximately. Could we now turn up, maybe to 600, 700? We now throw a radial blur on it. Now we can erase our lumetri again. We set it to radial because we don't want a circular distortion, but a radial one. So on the outside, what we see here, if I switch off the motion blur, we get a very strong blur on the sides, which pulls us upwards. That's not very interesting for us in the sky, so I would pull the mask up a bit. And maybe also make sure that we don't have such a strong influence on the edges here, only minimally. I'd set the effect a little bit smaller, maybe on 3, so we have a little blur. After all, you can see the edges in the lower area more clearly. That's the area that moves most in the camera and it can remain blurred. Then I turn on the motion blur again, which brings us the blur here. I'll let it run through again, so that you can get a feeling for how it looks after these two editing steps. Now our process is finished, and as you can see, it's turned into a super nice hyperlapse, very clean, no jerking in it, and especially in those crucial corners where we don't have any blur. Also, not to be seen up here, everything has become very, very clean. Again, a short note about the plugin. Now, for example, the Motion Blur plugin. I think the plugin is a bit expensive, but it's definitely worth the money because it gives us a very nice motion blur that makes our image look a bit smoother. It has to be said that this motion blur is also possible via detours in After Effects, but it's much more intensive work on the computer than this one. So I can only recommend that if you're really interested in getting a very clean hyperlapse and getting the last % out of your shots, you should get one. So, I'm going to touch and edit the other two shots again and go through the same process with the other shots as I did with this one. Then we can compare all shots again later and just see where problems occur and if the tripod version is really the best one. I'll show you again in the overview. Now I'm going to sit down and finish the other two shots. Now I've stabilized all shots. The first one in the handheld variation, this is shot number 1. The second shot is our monopod variation, shot 3 is the tripod I showed you before, and shot 4 is the bullfinch shot. Here we go through and have a look at the results. The handheld version is still pretty good now. Nevertheless, we see now here, especially in the outer area, that we have heavy light jerkers in it, especially with this light turn, which we are now doing here in the middle of the picture. Exactly at this point now. There we have strong jerking in here, which makes the picture very unsteady, but still a reasonable result in itself. We'll take a look at the second shot, which is the one with the monopod. It's cleaner, but it's still got some jerking in it. The third shot is our tripod shot. It's very clean, has the least jerking, and is also the smoothest in movement. Variant 4 is the gimbal shot. I didn't do the same tracking as in the first 3 shots, but worked with a warp stabilizer, which gives us a great result. However, we don't have a fixed point of reference now. The point up here, like in the other 3 shots, is a bit wobbly, but still this method works really well. I will now show you the qualities again. So we have our first shot here. There we have a curvature of 104.4, so the scaling that happened is 104.4. The number is in any case still okay, and if we look at the tracking data once, it looks like this. So relatively widespread. We will now see the direct comparison. For example, with shot 2, which is our monopod shot, it's much cleaner, and of course shot 3 is the cleanest. So as I said with the tripod variant, we can generate almost perfect hyperlapse, because of course we always have the possibility to aim at this point, and this is reflected in the values if we continue down here. So the monopod variant now with 103.8 and the tripod variant with 102.6. So the value becomes more and more precise. And if we take a little more time, maybe for the intervals or for adjusting, then we can probably get the value even smaller. That's a very good value in any case, because we don't want to crop our actual framing, which we used for the picture, too much. So here it is of course important that the value is small, so that we don't change our framing too much, which we actually set and wanted to have. The gimbal variant, which is now here with 101.6, whereby I must say that I made 2 passes. Here is another one before that I've already stabilized. So I applied a bit of a double procedure to this gimbal shot. Of course I have explained every method in detail and tried to show the advantages and disadvantages, but I think this overview will make it even clearer. Here we can also make a direct comparison between the shots. I've now installed a small zoom window, which we will see how it behaves at the edges and how the quality of the tracking points is. So in principle, once again, a big overview of our methods. I can only say that I'm someone who works very quality-oriented, so it's very important to me that the quality is right, our recordings, and of course what we deliver to the customer. That's why I would always tend towards the tripod shot and try to use it. But of course, you can't say in general that this is the best solution for every problem. It may be the best option in terms of quality, but of course we have areas of application where our other methods are also important or perhaps even better. Here we can now see that the handheld version has of course a very low quality value. It can be used, but the quality itself is not quite as strong compared to the other methods. However, we have a low time and equipment expenditure for it. With the monopod variant, this is relatively balanced, so we have a very good quality. Of course, we have a higher expenditure of time, and of course, we have to bring much more equipment to the production. With the tripod version, we have the best quality, but we also need a lot of time to create it, and we have to carry a lot of equipment around with us. The gimbal version is such a good all-rounder. Of course, it works very well in terms of quality, and it's not quite as time-consuming and technically demanding as the tripod shot, but it also has a different feel to it, because we cannot bridge such a long period of time, as is the case with the hyperlapse in the classic sense, photo after photo. For me, the tripod is clearly the best method, because we have full control over our exposure time, which is not so unimportant with hyperlapse, in order to get these disturbing elements out of the picture and of course make water or other objects disappear or appear smoother. So this is the reason why this tutorial is the winner for me, and I can only recommend it. The tripod shot is closely followed by the monopod version because it delivers a nearly similar quality, but we don't have the possibility to play with the exposure time. Therefore, one can actually say that the handheld and monopod versions can probably be used more in the travel sector, where it has to be fast, where we focus more on quantity than on quality. In the tutorial, we have now dealt most intensively with the tripod shot because it also delivers the best quality, and we can of course break down the lessons from this method to the other methods. But it's also the best method for me because it's the most pleasant to work with, and is also very pleasant in production because we have full control over the exposure time. This of course offers a lot more possibilities in the creative field to live it up and play with the exposure times. Of course, we don't have that with the other three versions, and that's why for me it's the key to the best hyperlapse, and I can only recommend everyone to work with the tripod. I have to say that the handheld and the monopod version have their right to exist anyway, and especially the monopod version is a very good alternative to the tripod because we can generate nearly a similar quality here, and of course we don't have as much effort in terms of equipment and time. So I hope you got a good overview of the whole post-production process and know how to stabilize a really good hyperlapse. Now we are done with this video, and the next video will be about the visual effects.